Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm Amber Mace. I'm the Executive Director of the California Council on Science and Technology, and it is our CCST Science and Technology Week. So we are thrilled to be dedicating a week to celebrating the role of science in helping California's policies be even stronger. And so I am very glad to have you here today. I also want to mention a few of our other events. I know I see some of you from that we saw last night at our reception. Thanks for coming to that. And those of you who aren't able to come, we do have more events this week. We have a translator showcase tomorrow where we get to hear from some graduate students who have come from around the state to talk about the research that they are developing now, and they're practicing how they communicate that to decision makers. So if you would love to hear how they're practicing, you are welcome to join us in the governor's conference room. On Thursday, we have another briefing as well, and that's on decarbonization. And that's the theme of our Science and Technology Week this year, is science at your service, and how science can help California meet its decarbonization goals. And so this is a briefing that is related to a report that we've released, and the briefing on Thursday is related to an emerging topic. And so what I'll do with this is just walk you through a little bit of background about CCST as an organization, our study process, and I'm going to hand it over to Mikkel, who led this for us on our staff, and then he's going to turn it over to our lead author, Judson Boomhower, for the details of the study. So let me see if I can get the clicker right. All right, so we've already, that stuff I just said. Okay, so CCST, the California Council on Science and Technology, is a nonpartisan nonprofit, and we were created at the request of the legislature. So it's nice to be here. Thank you. We've been around for 30 years, and the idea from the legislature 30 years ago is that we really need to have an impartial body that can connect back to the network of expertise that California has in its academic and research institutions, and that decision makers such as yourself need ready access to information, but the information that's coming out of these research institutions may not always be in the form that you need it or when you need it. And so our role is to serve as a translator and connector, and to really build off of that incredible network of partner institutions that we have. We are a nonprofit, so we have a board of directors that provides fiduciary oversight for the organization and represents our partner institutions. And these are our formal partners. So this is just a reminder of what California has at its service. And we're very lucky to live in a state that has such deep, deep expertise, and I would argue that our economy and society is built on the backbone of institutions like this. And so we're thrilled that we can partner with them and help bring what they're discovering to you. And one of the ways we do that and provide science services to make sure that you have the advice that you need is we present our CCST Science Fellows. I know there are some in the room, Jeff and JC, anybody, and Rachel, and we have some alums with the program too, who we've hired onto our staff, and this is just a great way for us to bring science in real time to decision makers. We have a whole other suite of services that we provide, briefings like this one, the studies that I will be talking about in just a moment, and workshops. So this study came from a specific request from the Department of Conservation, now CalGEM, the Division of Oil, Gas, and Geothermal, now CalGEM, and they wanted to better understand the potential liabilities that the state might be exposed to related to Orphan wells. I'm not going to say anything more about the topic because you're going to hear from the experts on that. I will tell you a little bit about our study process, and this is super important for the work that we do. When we're asked to take on a study, it's an opportunity for us to provide an independent perspective. It's not to say that the state couldn't do this in-house. Sometimes it's valuable to have an outside entity tap into, again, that network of expertise to provide that independent perspective where we can assemble a team of experts, we can conduct a rigorous process that includes evaluation of conflict of interest, that includes peer review, so that when we deliver the findings, you know that they have the credibility that you need to inform the decisions that you're making with them. And so we were very happy that the Department of Conservation reached out to help us perform this, or ask us to perform this study. And the study is based on existing information and analysis of data that were provided to us by the state and the expertise of the team that we convened. And I think I turn it over to you now, Mikhail.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
All right, so the report is broken up into 4 chapters. I'm going to provide just a high-level overview and introduction for those of you new to the topic, and then Professor Boomhower will go into his economic analysis. So, in a typical life cycle of an oil and gas well, there's a period of exploration followed by well construction, at which point an operator would file an indemnity bond. So this is something they file up front, the amount of money that they would get back upon plugging and abandoning the well. So after that well is constructed, it goes into hopefully a period of many years or many decades of production. And once the production rate's slow or that well is no longer producing, the operator will then plug and abandon the well, decommission the surrounding facilities, and return the site to its prior condition. However, if the market rates drop for oil and gas, or if the production on that well begins to slow, an operator may decide to idle that well. And an idle well is considered, a well is classified as idle after 2 years of not producing any oil. And idle wells can be returned to production, so if market prices increase and it's economically viable again, they can return those wells to production and continue producing until they plug and abandon the wells. However, after a period of being idle for 3 years, operators have to start paying idle well fees or file an idle well management plan in order to commit to eliminating a certain percentage of their long-term idle well stock every year. So this is a bit of an incentive to get operators to draw down the number of idle wells. Now, at any point in this process, a well could become an orphan well. So the orphan wells are wells that have no viable owner or operator capable of plugging and abandoning the wells or decommissioning the facilities. This is often the result of a bankruptcy. So California has a number of practices in place in order to mitigate the potential effects of orphan wells. I'm going to highlight just 4 of them here, and there's more details in the report. So number 1, this form of financial assurance I talked about, commonly in the form of indemnity bonds. So at an individual well level, these range from the lowest amount of $25,000 all the way up to $3 million for a blanket bond that covers 10,000 or more wells. Individual bonds are based on well depth, whereas the blanket bonds are based on the number of wells you have. And these bonds are paid up front as an incentive to the operator to then plug and decommission the well, at which point they can recover the bond. Now, offshore wells are treated a little bit differently, so they require a $1 million blanket bond up front, as well as a supplemental form of security to cover the entire cost of plugging and abandoning that operator's entire offshore well stock. So these supplemental securities are often held within the leases for the lands that the wells are on. This is commonly with the State Lands Commission. And the idle well fees that I mentioned before, so these kick in after the 3rd year of a well being classified as an idle well. And these range from $150 up to $1,500 per year per well. And the fees increase for the older the well is. Or operators can file idle management plans. So these are commitments from the operator to eliminate a certain percentage of their long-term idle well stock. These are long-term idle wells have been idle for 8 or more years. So they have to eliminate 4 to 6% depending on how many idle wells they have. And the 4th thing, there are a few funds that the division can use to plug some of these hazardous or orphan wells. There's the Hazardous and Idle Deserted Well Abatement Fund, and this is where the fees from the idle well, the funds from the idle well fees are deposited, and these can be used at any time. They're continuously appropriated to the division. And then there's a separate amount that is capped by the legislature that essentially comes from the division's budget, which comes from the fees assessed on fuel production on the operators. So this is currently capped at $3 million per year, targeted toward hazardous wells or so-called idle deserted wells or orphan wells. So these are the practices in place, and with kind of these considerations in mind, we'll now move into kind of the heart of the report, which is this economic assessment of what the landscape looks like for California.
Okay. Great. So I'm Judson Boomhower. I'm an economics professor at UC San Diego. My work deals with energy and the environment, including oil and gas production and environmental regulation in oil and gas. So I'm going to take you through chapter 3 of the report. I'm going to try and tailor this for the level of the audience that I'm pretty sure we have here. I think we've been instructed to hold questions until the end, but I won't be offended if you have clarifying questions you ask. Just raise your hand and I'll, tell me if I'm not being clear about any of this. Okay, so Amber and Mikkel have done a really good job of laying the groundwork, right? Our task in this chapter is to think about the rough scope of the net liabilities to the state of California from orphan oil and gas wells. I'm going to do the dangerous thing of starting with the answer, so giving you the spoiler at the beginning of the talk. I'm going to put up this table. We're going to come back to this table at the end of the presentation, and when we come back at the end, all of these numbers will make more sense and have more context, but this is a useful place to start because it lets me tell you what we're going to do and how we're going to get to some answers. So what I'm going to take you through this analysis of the cost of plugging oil and gas wells, and I'm going to think about certain parts of the policy problem that are going to put together into the holistic picture at the end of the report. So let me be specific. One thing that we're going to do, the first thing that we're going to talk about is how to take 107,000 active and idle oil and gas wells in California and roughly screen them into 4 groups based on how much of an imminent threat they seem to pose in terms of becoming an orphan well. That's the first contribution of this chapter. The next thing that I'm going to take you through is how to think about what it would cost to plug and remediate all of those wells in each category. So that's going to get us to some numbers about total costs of plugging. Then we'll think about to what extent are those costs offset by bonds that have already been deposited with the state. So in the unlikely event that the state were to immediately become responsible for plugging and decommissioning all of the oil and gas wells in California, how much financial security money would the state have to offset that obligation? That's this bonds column. And then I'm going to put all of those numbers together and give you this picture of net liability, potential net liability across all of these categories. Okay. So every one of those steps that I took you through involves important assumptions and modeling choices. So what I want to spend a lot of our time on is developing a little more of the analysis for you about how we come to all of those answers. Okay. So let's start just with some quick overview statistics about the inventory of oil and gas wells in California. There are about 230,000 wells in formerly Dogger, now CalGEM's oil and gas database. About 122,000 of those have already been plugged. And that leaves an inventory of 107,000-ish active and idle oil and gas wells. So this is the population of wells that we're going to be thinking about for the most part in this report. Let me do that. California, oil fields in California are mature, right? This is an industry that This is an industry that is different than the oil and gas industry in other parts of the United States right now. There's not a ton of new production. The median The median well in the active and idle data set is producing 2.7 barrels of oil equivalent per day, which is not very much for those of you who are not oil and gas people. The median well started producing in 1989, so this is an old population of wells. 97.7% of these wells are onshore, so 2.5% are offshore. So the report primarily is focused on onshore wells because that does represent by far the largest component of wells. There are really interesting and important questions about offshore wells that we hint at a little bit in the report, but that's not our main focus. And something like 30% of the wells in this data set are idle. Okay. So that's the overall kind of state of the well population. The first thing I want to take you through in terms of analytical results is I want to tell you how we took those 107,000 oil and gas wells and used production data to think about how much risk each one of them may pose of becoming an orphan well in the short run. And so we put them in 4 categories. The first category we called likely orphan wells. So this is a category of wells that we think, in all likelihood, have already been orphaned. These are wells where the responsible operator hasn't produced anything from this well or from any of the other wells that operator has in California for at least 5 years. So these are wells where we see no signs of life from the operator or from the well, and there are about 2,500 wells in this category that we're going to consider likely orphan wells. In all likelihood, these will eventually become the responsibility of the state if they have no other. The second category we called high risk. So what we did here is we thought about wells where the well itself has been idle for 5 years or longer. So nothing is happening production-wise with the given well, but the operator of record is showing signs of life elsewhere in the state of California. So the operator exists, but on average, their wells are producing less than 5 barrels per day. So these are operators that are overall economically marginal and small, right? So how do I get a high-risk well? A high-risk well isn't producing anything itself. It belongs to an operator who tends to operate low economic value wells, economically marginal wells, and tends to be small. Of course, there are a bunch of specific and honestly somewhat arbitrary assumptions here about 5+ years and 5 barrels per day and 1,000 active wells. So in the appendix of the report, we give you some scenario analysis where we think about how do these numbers change if we vary these individual modeling choices. Qualitatively, the picture doesn't depend too much on these decisions, but that information is there if you're interested. This second screen gives us another population of about 3,000 wells that seem like they belong to operators that are hanging in there, but potentially economically marginal, and we're worried about negative economic shocks to that operator, potentially pushing these wells into orphan status. The next category is a big one. There's a lot of wells in category 3. We call this the other idle and marginal well category. So here we've put all of the wells that don't belong to these high-risk operators that are producing less than 5 barrels per day. Again, this is a very coarse way of identifying economically marginal wells. But it's what we could do with the time and information that we had at our disposal. And what this gives you is this large population of wells that are themselves economically marginal, but belong to operators who, at least in the short run, appear to be financially robust. I think that there are operators in this category that you could ask interesting questions about in terms of their longer run financial viability, but this is a category that doesn't include operators that we think of as imminently at risk of being tipped over by small changes in market conditions. And then finally, category 4 is the rest of the wells in the state, which are the wells producing above 5 barrels of oil equivalent per day. That's about 30,000 wells. These, to a first approximation, are wells that we think of as likely to be economic, likely to generate valuable production in the near future, so that even if the operators of these wells were to fall off the face of the earth, it's relatively likely that another operator would be interested in picking them up and operating them and making some money. Again, these thresholds, you can vary them and the numbers change a little bit as you change the threshold, but this is the categorization that we have in the report. I will also say that one of our recommendations for further study is to do this type of screening exercise in a much more granular way. So if you wanted to spend more time and do this with more information, one could imagine, instead of applying a simple barrels per day cutoff, one could imagine trying to go field by field and think about production costs at a well level or at a field level, and really try and identify truly economically marginal wells in a much more granular way. Similarly, one could get a lot more specific, going operator by operator and thinking about balance sheets and financial solvency. That's all analysis that can, in principle, be done. It would be time consuming, but it may be worth doing. So that's in our recommendations. So let me stop here. This is sort of contribution 1 of the report, right? A tabulation of wells according to orphaning risk. So let's all take a breath. And I'm going to move on and tell you a little bit more about where these likely orphan wells and high risk of becoming orphan wells are located. So, to a first approximation, where are the wells at highest risk of becoming orphan wells? Well, they're loosely concentrated in the same places that oil and gas wells are concentrated in California overall. So, Southern California, there's some Kern County stuff. When I stare at this graph, at these maps, there's not any particular location that jumps out at me as overwhelmingly important for orphan well risk. This is a problem that's distributed throughout the state. Okay, the second real meaty piece of the analysis is we're going to think about how much would it cost the state to deal with any wells that it does inherit as orphan wells. And to do that, we're going to use a small sample of historical plugging costs that were compiled by Dogger. So the agency knew in some level of detail how much money it had spent in the past to plug 86 orphan wells. This is the data that was available to us to think about plugging cost, is well by well records of how much was spent to plug these 86 orphan wells. What we have done is pretty straightforward, right? We've basically calculated the average plugging cost for wells according to 4 formerly Dogger districts. So this tells us the average cost of what has in the past been the average cost to the state to plug orphan wells in each of these 4 districts. The overall average cost is about $70,000. But that's highly geographically variable. So the southern district, which includes the city of Los Angeles, runs about $150,000 on average to plug orphan wells. We're going to show you some figures that dig into that and try and break that out a little bit more. One potentially sensible explanation for why this number is so much higher than costs in all the other regions is simply that it's expensive to do this in places that have a lot of population density. We're trying to do to take care of this problem in urban centers. So what this gives us is a picture of how much it has cost in the past to plug orphan wells in every Dogger district, and we are going to use this information to basically scale up the potential costs of plugging all the wells in the state of California. So every southern district well, we're going to assume that it would cost $150,000 to plug and decommission. Every northern district well, we're going to assume it would cost $50,000, et cetera. And doing that is going to give us our picture of projected plugging costs. This, again, there are many ways that this analysis could be improved, and we give some recommendations in the report for ways to study this going forward. Those essentially involve collecting more data and making that data centralized and available. As the state does spend more money to plug a larger population of wells, the confidence intervals around all these averages will tighten up quite a bit with bigger sample size. And then also anything else that can be done to increase information about well plugging costs would be valuable. Okay. So this figure is showing you the same information as that table. It's also giving you a sense of the distribution, right? So this is plugging and decommissioning costs in the historical sample of 86 wells by Dogger district. I think the thick vertical bars here are the averages. And then for the real nerds out there, this is the interquartile range. Right, so this is the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile. A fourth of the costs are below this line, a fourth of the costs are above this line, and then these dots are outliers. So this is kind of, if I were teaching my microeconomics class, I would say this is for the kids in the front row. If you want to understand more of the details, it's in this figure in the report. Okay. But the important takeaway is the average costs, and then the fact that southern district costs are substantially higher than costs in the rest of the state. Okay, why might it be that there's so much variation across space in how much it costs to plug wells? That's a really important question that we think deserves more study. We weren't able to answer it with this population of 86 wells when we started trying to run regression analyses to really isolate different channels of cost. We just quickly ran out of statistical power. We ran out of the ability to make statements with such a small number of wells. But we can draw some sort of suggestive conclusions from just thinking about the variation that exists in the raw data. One is that there is a pretty clear relationship between the cost of plugging a well and population density. So every marker in this plot is one well that the state has plugged in the past. The x-axis here is population density in the place where the well is located. The y-axis is how much did it cost the state to plug the well. Well, there's a pretty clear increasing trend here with population density. So it certainly seems like the wells in places where more people live are more expensive to plug. And that's intuitive, and it kind of lines up with our previous understanding of where is it expensive to do things. So I think that makes sense. We could do some more work. Others could do more work to really get to the bottom of that relationship. And then another thing that we thought we might find some relationship between the age of the well and how much it costs the state to plug the well. Here, nothing jumps out as much from the data as it does here, but it does look like there's a little bit of a relationship between the spud date, or the date that the well was initially drilled, and how much it costs the state to plug the well. So more younger wells that were drilled more recently, appear to be less expensive to plug than these really old wells that were drilled in the 50s and 60s. And again, I think that's intuitive, and we can all think of reasons that might be true. Okay. Great. So that's the cost part of the report. That was component 2. So I want to shift gears now and talk about the third component of the report. This is where we're going to think about how much bond money does the state of California have? How much money can the state call on through these bonds to offset any potential plugging obligations that the state inherits? So here, we're going to calculate something that I'm going to call effective bond coverage. This is going to be a very simple number. I'm just going to take the amount of bonds for a given population of wells, and I'm going to divide it by the number of wells that it's supposed to cover. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start with all of the bond money that the state has for all of the wells. That's $110 million. For all of the onshore wells. Again, Mikkel made the important caveat in his talk that there are several tens of millions of dollars more bond money for offshore wells with the State Lands Commission. But for onshore wells, there's $110 million of bond money that the state can call on. If you divide that by 106,687 active and idle wells, that gives you about $1,000 per well of effective bond coverage, right? So this is a useful statistic because it kind of highlights how small, honestly, the available bond money is relative to the potential scale of the plugging obligations. Remember, the average cost of plugging a well was $68,000, which is a big number relative to $1,000 per well. Okay. I'm going to take you through another couple slides where we're going to think about what explains this big gap. But the answer is basically that there seems to be a population of wells that where bonds were never required in the past, where they were essentially grandfathered into not having to comply with bond requirements. And then the other reason is that there are a few large operators that cover a really big number of wells with blanket bonds, so that when you divide those blanket bonds by all of the operators' wells, on average the bond amounts are pretty small. Okay. Right, so I'm now going to calculate this effective bond coverage statistic for different populations of wells. So I showed you what happens when I divide all of the bond money for the state by all of the wells that exist in the state. Now we're going to cut operators into 3 groups. So I'm going to think about effective bond coverage for operators that have fewer than 1,000 wells, effective bond coverage for operators with 1,000 to 10,000 wells, and effective bond coverage for operators with over 10,000 wells. So this is a useful figure, I think, for a few reasons. One, it really makes the point about blanket bonds, right? So let's start at the top. The small number of operators in the state that are responsible for over 10,000 wells, when you take the blanket bonds that they have filed with the state and divide them by these tens of thousands of wells, you end up with very little bond coverage per well. Right? That's intuitive. You can see how the math would work out that way. It's tempting to look at this and say, oh my gosh, there's near zero effective bond per well for this population of wells. And that's a true fact, but there's an important subtlety here, which is that this group of operators includes some major international oil and gas producers that are highly unlikely to disappear off the face of the earth tomorrow. So yes, there's not very much bond coverage for this population of wells. On the other hand, you have to think carefully about how much risk these operators actually pose in terms of bankruptcy. In the short run, I would argue that risk is relatively small. In the longer run, I think you can have interesting conversations about the scale of that risk for some of these operators. And then the other thing that's interesting is when you get down to the really small guys, the guys who we think may pose more of a threat of quote-unquote disappearing off the face of the earth, this is a population where the effective bond per well is still really small. So this is like $2,200 per well against an average cost of about $68,000 per well. So the reason I wanted to show you this slide is I wanted to make the point that small bond amounts are not entirely explained by blanket bonds. It's also true that even small operators have relatively low bond amounts per well. Okay. I'm going to take a detour for a second and talk about the effect of recent changes, recent policy changes that generated some potential money through a new program called the Idle Well Fees Program. So some of you know this intimately, but for those of you who don't know, in the past couple of years, the state of California has started requiring operators of idle wells to essentially check in with the state every year, respond to a letter about what's going on with their well, and make a choice to either pay a small fee to keep the well idle, or to develop a plan for how they're going to how they're going to cut down their population of idle wells over time. So these idle well fees potentially create a stream of revenue to offset some of the plugging costs. What we say in the report, after doing a little bit of back of the envelope math, is that in a quantitative sense, the amount of that money is relatively small compared to the scale of the plugging obligations that we're talking about. So when we did the back of the envelope analysis, it seemed like the most money you could ever get from idle well fees, if every operator chose to pay fees instead of developing an idle well management plan, was going to be about $16 million per year. When we finished this report some time ago, we had a sort of what we thought of as a generous upper bound of how much was actually going to be produced of about $11 million per year. And Mikhail and I were just looking at the more recent numbers today. It looks like the actual amount of money coming into idle well fees appears to be about $4 million a year. So this is a meaningful source of revenue, but probably small compared to the scale of the liabilities. I did want to highlight there is another benefit of the idle well program, which is, in my perspective, a very good thing, which is simply that now every year, every operator of an idle well gets a letter from the state of California, and that's an opportunity to sort of check in on the health of that operator, right? There is a lot of information that is revealed when that operator does or does not reply to that letter. In the past, it was pretty difficult to look at the population of idle wells and know which ones didn't have a viable existing operator. It's much easier now because you can just look at who doesn't return it's more complicated, so to be fair, it's more complicated than that, but there's a lot of information that's revealed when someone does not return their idle well fee program. Okay, so perfect. So I want to bring all the pieces together now and wrap up, and then we'll have a little time for question and answer. This is the table I showed you at the beginning. I told you that after we all thought hard together for 30 minutes, we were going to understand it intimately, and I hope that's more or less true. But let me just remind you what we learned, right? We categorized the population of orphan wells into likely orphan wells, wells at high risk of becoming orphan wells, other idle and marginal wells that may not pose an imminent orphaning risk today, but where it's important to think about the risk they might pose in the future, and then a higher producing population of wells where, again, it's important to think about for the future, but the quote-unquote future is probably even further off for this last group of wells. If you add up what we think will be the total cost to plug all of those wells, you get something like $9.2 billion. That is offset by about $100 million of bond liability. So in the unlikely worst case scenario where suddenly tomorrow all of this money, all of this obligation were to fall on the state of California, all of these operators just disappeared, then the state could face up to $9 billion in liability for orphan wells. I would argue that it's more instructive to focus on this $300 million and this $200 million if you're worried about what is the near-term potential liability for orphan wells. And if you're interested in what's going to happen in the much longer term, then these numbers are also, I think, interesting to consider. So I think I want to leave it there and make sure we have some time for your questions. If there are any. Yeah. Oh yeah. I think that the gentleman in the green shirt is.
Is there an inherent cost difference between the state sealing a well and the industry sealing a well?
It's a good question, and it's reasonable to think that there would be, and I certainly would. It would be valuable to get numbers from industry if they'd be willing to share them about how much it costs them to do this. There are two reasons that might be true. One is just maybe you're the kind of person who thinks that the state is more expensive for the state to do anything. But the other reason that I think is interesting is that the operator knows more about that well when they go down the wellbore to fix the problem. The state is basically taking on this thing that could have been idle for decades, and it's just really, so there's value in having operators do this because it's their asset and they know what's down there. So it's useful to, it's probably cheaper to have them do it if you can get them to do it. Yeah. There's another one.
I have a question about likely orphan wells group and the wells at high risk of orphan wells group.
Yeah.
Are these operators with 1 to 2 wells, or how many operators can you guess?
Yeah, so that's in that number is in the report, table 1 summary statistics, but it's on the order of magnitude like 1,000 operators that we're talking about. And the number, like, certainly, yes, some of them have 2 wells, and some of them have 50, and some of them, there's a big distribution of the size. I definitely encourage you to look at the report. That's all there. Yeah.
And then, given Dogger's history of spotty record keeping, there's lots of wells that were plugged with telephone poles and other things 100 years ago, and those should be considered orphan wells. Has been any consideration of that?
That's a super, so there's a paragraph in the report where we mention that, and the one thing that I'm not endorsing what you said about spotty record keeping. I am endorsing what you said about this question of thinking about wells that were plugged a long time ago. And so the one thing that we do in the report to think about that is we cut that population of previously plugged wells into ones that were plugged. I'm going to get the year wrong, but there's a year after which we think modern plugging requirements were more likely to have been enforced. And so we cut the data by wells plugged before that year and wells plugged after that year, and we say these guys that you might think of as the telephone pole population are important too. We don't give them a cost, but we need to know more about them. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question. I missed the first 30 minutes, so we may have already discussed this. What is the actual process of decommissioning the well or plugging it? Is it like cement? Is it like mechanically you do it? Like, can you walk us through what that actually looks like?
Sure. I mean, so you should have an engineer here to tell you exactly, but there is a cement plug needs to go down the wellbore that's gonna prevent fluids from coming up the wellbore and causing water contamination and prevent methane from leaking. And then there's potentially surface remediation that needs to happen around the well site to clean up, float lines and storage tanks and all kinds of other stuff. That can vary quite a bit from well to well, and it can cause the cost to vary a lot too. Yeah.
Is there anything we can learn from that one well that cost $400,000 to plug?
So that's a well, if I remember correctly, that's a well that was in the city of LA, and it was plugged, it was an emergency, so it was discovered to be leaking, and there was it needed to be plugged really fast, it was in an urban area. So certainly one thing you can learn from that is that the kind of worst case plugging costs can be quite high. I would just stress that it's worth compiling a bigger population of plugging costs to see whether that's an aberration or whether that's something that is going to kind of occur more frequently. Yeah.
In the cutoffs for when developing well would still be financially viable at 5 barrels per day, I'm assuming that was assuming that they're using conventional extraction methods. How would fracking change that calculus?
That's an important question, and that's where I would say, again, I would put that in the bucket of more sophisticated kind of well-by-well production cost analysis. For an existing well that's been producing for a long time, if you're not thinking about re-entering and recompleting the well, then fracking isn't going to do anything, because fracking is a one-time thing that you do that then yields a big stream of production over a long time. If you're thinking about what they would call new completions, workovers of existing wells, then the availability of fracturing technologies could change the economics of those projects in some places, for sure. Thanks for your questions. It's been fantastic, and I'll hang out for a couple minutes if folks want to chat after. Thanks for your attention.